Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response to the Tao. Today, we're going to look at two short sentences, and they appear together. First is to cheat the uninformed and slander fellow students. So it relates to basically how we treat people that we have care of in terms of instructing in some way, could be mentoring, some form of teaching, and how we treat our classmates, fellow students, fellow learners. So in relation to the first sentence, I'd like to share with you three historical accounts. But before we head into the stories, it's good to be clear about what we mean by uninformed in this particular context. And it's basically where a person is in a position of informational disadvantage. So they may know relatively less. They could be relatively less experienced in some field of expertise, and therefore they're vulnerable in terms of relying on us or another person to share and share their experience, share their knowledge, and instruct them, guide them in some way. So that's what the Exalted Treatise is referring to by uninformed. So it doesn't mean that they're completely illiterate or uneducated. And then to cheat is basically to take advantage of that informational disadvantage, to mislead or deceive the uninformed. So it definitely is referring to a context where there's some instructor, a tutor, could be a mentor, or some form of teacher or guide that is in a relatively privileged position because of the fact that they happen to know more about a particular subject matter or area of expertise. Okay. Now, the three historical accounts come from the Collectanea on the Way and its Virtue, and all three come from volume 9 that relates to scholars, and that's called Positive Anecdotes. These are sort of true stories about examinations, those preparing to sit the examinations, those who have sat the examinations, and they're all, scholars in some shape or form. The first story is entitled To Mislead People for Life, and the other two are to mislead someone's children. And the first account relates to Mr. Zhang. We don't know much more to his name other than his surname, and he lived in the late 16th century in Jiangsu province. It's a particular place in China, and he had a flair for writing as a scholar, and he had actually literally he attempted the civil service examinations 7 times without success. Now, these examinations would generally be, once a year or once every 2 years. So he had obviously tried numerous occasions over an extended period of time without success. So, by the end of the last time, he prayed to Lord Wenchang. And if you can remember, Lord Wenchang is the patron deity to do with the literary arts and culture. So scholars wanted to do well in the examinations would often pray to Lord Wenchang to seek blessings. And so Mr. Zhang did the same. He had tried 7 times, failed on all occasions. And that night, he has a dream of Lord Wenchang, I'll just turn off the slides for a moment. And okay. And this Lord Wenchang tells him in no uncertain terms what his problems are. Okay, he points out to him that not passing the examinations is part of the misfortune that he has brought about on himself because of his misdeeds. And as you can imagine, Mr. Zhang was probably thinking, what sort of misdeeds? I've just been a scholar. Well, Lord Wenchang points out to him that, how could he possibly even aspire to a career as a respectable government official, with all the wealth and honor, prestige and social status that sort of a role had to offer. And the fact that, that sort of role people sought to become government officials to really make a positive difference to their communities. So Lord Wenchang is telling him, you can forget about that. And why that is because of all the misdeeds you've accumulated. What does he mean exactly? There's, if you think about it, for the last 15 years, you've enjoyed a very high salary as a teacher. You've been able to be appointed as the teacher for no less than 5 families. So in those days, families, particularly well-off families, would appoint a tutor or teacher to teach the family, the children and the grandchildren of the whole family, that extended family clan. And then the tutor would come to teach within their household. And so, that's how children were generally educated. For families who were couldn't afford to appoint their own teacher, well, maybe they would join a village, sort of join the village school, or sort of try to join the class of the nearest family school. But Mr. Zhang has had the good fortune of being appointed by no less than 5 families to teach the children and grandchildren. But what has he done? He's basically not taught them anything. Mr. Zhang has, in fact, rewritten their written assignments. He's deceived their parents and their extended family, the family elders, as to the progress of the students, and as a result really ruined their futures. So, in the very important early years of their life, when they should have been getting a good education, a proper education, learning how to read and write, etc., to stand them in good stead for the rest of their life, well, Mr. Zhang hasn't really been doing that for his students. And Lord Wenchang also points out that, look, your income is more than enough for your own expenditures, provide for your food and clothes, etc. And yet you gather your students around and gamble with them. And you do so without a care for the ruinous consequences of these gambling activities, for those students and their families. They're gambling away their monies, while wasting their time, effectively. And Lord Wenchang asks Mr. Zhang, is that really what you think a teacher should be doing? Whether that's inside the classroom or outside of the classroom, really makes him reflect on himself and sort of think again about what he's been doing for all of these years. It's been going on for 15 years. As the teacher, that sort of realize, well, for your students, really setting the bar or the standard. The students don't know any better. And, from what the teacher does, what they say, to say, you don't have to do any homework. Well, maybe you don't have to do any homework. It's okay to gamble your days away. and you think that that's probably acceptable, the right thing to do even. So it sets a very ruinous consequences for all of the students that Mr. Zhang had in his care for all of these 15 years. And if you really think about it, one child, one student, if they miss out on a proper education in the formative years of their life, it affects the rest of their life, doesn't it? It affects whether or not they can actually get a job to support themselves, whether they can ultimately end up being able to support their own families. And if they're unable to do so, they could well become a burden on the whole of society, on the rest of the community. So there are, detrimental consequences all around. Hence the title of the story is, the ruining, the life, mislead people for life, ruining their lives for entire lifetimes. So Mr. Zhang, he has this dreaming about Lord Wenchang and what Lord Wenchang has to say about him. And he wakes up in a state of shock. As you can imagine, it's it's a wake-up call to him, to realize what he's actually done with his time in his life for the last 15 years. And shortly after that particular instant, his dream, one or more of his students, it's recorded, dies, gets beaten to death because of their gambling activities. We don't know the details. Maybe they were unable to pay their debts or whatever. But Mr. Zhang, as a teacher, and in those days, teachers tended to be, quite well respected within the community. Clearly they were entrusted with the children and grandchildren of these extended families. But Mr. Zhang is the humiliation of being implicated in the court proceedings to do with this death. And a few years later, all of his savings, so all the money that he earned as a teacher, runs out, and he passes away not long after that. So as you can sort of start to, when you put the facts together, he had accumulated all of this misdeeds over the 15 years of supposedly teaching these young students, had such a ruinous impact on their future and the future of the lives around them, that his income, the money that he derived, was depleted, and so was his own lifespan. So we read earlier in the Exalted Treatise that when a person commits misdeeds, they lose money. And not only that, their lifetime, their expected lifespan gets depleted in units of anywhere from 100 days to 12 years. And when that lifespan runs out, because of the misdeeds and the reductions, then the person loses their life and they pass away. And, it just so happens to Mr. Zhang in this particular circumstance. And you might be thinking, well, could just have been a matter of coincidence. How can we be absolutely sure? Well, there are two other stories it just happens to be in the same particular section of the book. Now, the second historical account relates to a scholar by the name of Tan Bofu. And this particular scholar is also, talented. He made a name for himself through his learning and teaching of the 4 books, the 4 books of Confucian learning that you might have heard about before. Now, because of his great reputation, he had actually participated in some of the examinations and was ranked fairly highly. There were many wealthy families who appointed Mr. Tan to be their instructor or teacher for their family schools, to teach their children and grandchildren. Where it's recorded that Mr. Tan would wear really bright, colourful and decorated garments. So his clothes were quite outstanding. Maybe they were fairly extravagant. He would be a person who would get along with everyone, basically. And he was extremely clever. He had a head full of, bright ideas and clever schemes. And it's recorded that he could even read the minds of his students. Now, this was a really intelligent person, very talented as well. But instead of teaching, day-to-day classwork, he would tell stories in class to his students. So there wasn't any serious teaching involved. You're probably wondering, how could this person get away with this? Well, when the time came to compose, written essays or other sorts of, writing compositions, Mr. Tan would correct all of the draft papers of his students and have them copy out the corrected versions in their own handwriting. So, the parents thought that every one of them got full marks, didn't they? On top of that, Mr. Jung would, mark their work, give them, compliments and praise. And this fooled all of the parents and the family elders. They thought that, those students had progressed considerably in all the time that Mr. Tan spent with them. The students, what really happened in his classroom, besides the stories, would be the students would play games all day, they would joke about, without the slightest care in the world that they would be discovered. You could say the students didn't really know any better. They were young, not sure of the age group, but Mr. Jung probably had the gift of the gab and could talk himself out of everything. In fact, all of the parents and the families were convinced that he was really, giving their children and their grandchildren a quality education. So whenever parents or family elders happened to be present, Mr. Tan would be sure to praise their children to the skies. And they literally were convinced that their children had actually made real progress in their studies, and they would feel immensely grateful to him, and rewarded him accordingly. Now, no one ever found out. And it went on for decades, not just 15 years, but decades. And all this time, no one found out, but strangely, Tan Bofu never passed the civil service examinations. And in those days, it was fairly typical that a scholar would support themselves by taking on teaching appointments while they prepared to sit the civil service examinations in hopes of obtaining a position in the government service and becoming, local officials, government officials, to serve the wider community and, enjoy all the wealth and honour that role would bring. But in all of the times that Mr. Tan attempted the examinations, he failed. Now, on the final attempt, he had managed to predict the exam question. The actually turned out to be the very first question asked in the exam paper. That happened to be the question that he had prepared for. So there was no question. He had done his homework. He had done prepared to the best of his ability. And in those times, you had to travel to certain centres. It could have been the capital city to undertake these examinations. And so he had to lodge at an accommodation. He shared that particular room with 2 other examination candidates. And, while he was, before the exam, he had written up some practice essays that turned out to be, the answers to the very first exam question. And he wrote these 2 essays, and he had 2 roommates. They each took, one each, to help them in their preparations. And then, on the day, Mr. Tan wrote an even better version of the 2 essays. Now, his roommates only had half the answer because they only took 1 paper each. And so Mr. Tan is thinking, I'm bound to pass and excel in this examination at last. That's almost a certainty. I've accurately predicted the exam question. I've prepared fully to answer the question, so how could I possibly fail this time? He's absolutely certain. But when the results come out, both of his roommates pass, but he doesn't. So you can imagine his anguish, his disappointment. He doesn't understand. How could that have happened? They only had half the answer. Right? He had 2 papers. They each took, 1 each, and to help them prepare for their own examination preparations. But he had the full answer, and he even wrote a better version of that full answer. So how could his roommates pass, and he not pass? And he was terribly disappointed, as you can imagine. And he actually travels to Hangzhou, to a particular temple, and he sort of lodges there for the night, trying to find answers to the questions in his mind. And that night, he has a dream. He dreams of a spirit, and the spirit tells him quite severely, in no uncertain terms, that you shouldn't even think about passing the civil service examinations. The spirit really takes him to task. He explains to Tan Bofu that in a previous lifetime, he had actually been a butcher, and he had accumulated so many misdeeds from slaughtering so many animals. But he did do, a good deed, and that was to donate 50 gold pieces to the renovation of the temple in honor of Lord Wenchang, as I mentioned before, the sort of the patron deity for the literary arts. And so because of this good deed, he was able to, in this lifetime, enjoy the good fortune of, his intelligence, and, being appointed as a teacher by these wealthy families for, so many decades. So, but unfortunately, his good luck was about to run out, and his life would come to an end. He would, because he had sort of exhausted that good fortune from the previous good deeds, and in this lifetime, he'd have to face the music, literally, for the misdeeds in the past. But not only those misdeeds, the misdeeds he'd accumulated in this present lifetime. He was supposed to be a teacher, but he had failed in his teaching responsibilities. So even though nobody ever found out, all the families, the parents were convinced that he was, really helping their children, grandchildren learn and be educated. You could say Mr. Tan had fooled nobody at all, particularly all the spirits who oversee all of the human conduct, that keep track of the good deeds and misdeeds. So the fact that he had spent decades as a teacher without teaching anyone anything, well, that was, accumulation of serious misdeeds in this lifetime, not to mention the misdeeds that had already built up in the previous lifetime. So his future isn't looking too good at this point. And the Spirit makes a point that you've ruined the lives of so many students. And that misdeed, or those misdeeds, is actually far worse than actually killing those students, ending their lives altogether. I read this, I thought, surely this must be some exaggeration. But if you think about it, students, if they haven't received a proper education, in their early years, in their years that they go to school, they miss out on countless opportunities later on. They're unable to realize their full potential because they lack the basic foundational knowledge and the skills, being able to read and write properly, etc. So that would impact them for the rest of their life. They would have to suffer the consequences of not receiving a proper education for the rest of their life. And as I mentioned before, it's not just them, that particular individual, but all the lives that they would touch upon, and the people who care about them, they're the people that they care for in the future. They end up having their own families, whether they're able to support their own families and, let alone contribute to the rest of the community, or would they, because of the fact that they lacked a proper education, end up becoming a burden on everyone in that society? So if you can understand, that's sort of why the misdeed of failing to educate, even just one student, can be far worse than the physical act of ending their life. It has implications on so many people, on the rest of society, etc. Imagine if that particular student or child turned to crime, that would be even worse. So, and as a teacher, Mr. Tan had set the wrong example on so many levels. The poor students who didn't know any better, they would think that, dressing up nicely, lying to their family, to their elders, their parents, just wasting the time, playing games throughout the day, that would be acceptable conduct. They're at the informational disadvantage. They're the students in that relationship. And what the teacher does, how the teacher teaches them, it's from that they learn, okay, well, what's right and what's wrong. So unfortunately, you could say Mr. Tan, in all the things that he did, from the clothes that he wore, the way that he interacted with these families who appointed him, the fact that he took advantage of the students, well, the students would end up learning all of that negative behaviors. So that's also adds to the seriousness of the misdeeds. Now, the Spirit tells Mr. Tan that his life would be over very soon, and he would be reborn as a pig to suffer, slaughter, the suffering of being slaughtered. So don't even think about passing the civil service examinations. He wakes up in a state of shock. He ends up becoming very ill, and it's recorded that he actually made the sounds of a pig as he passed away a short time after that. He had one son who wasn't, maybe he was, suffered some mental disability, but his son passes away at a very early age. And then he had 2 grandsons. One became a thief and the other became a beggar. So you still sort of start to appreciate that the accumulated misdeeds brought about misfortune for poor Mr. Tan himself. So his life ends very early, but also for the other members of the family. The extent of the misfortune was such that not only did he suffer, but his children, his grandchildren, more than one generation suffered the consequences of his poor actions. So, you can start to see a bit of a trend. Now, then there's another young scholar by the name of Mr. Shen in Hangzhou. We're not too sure exactly when he lived, but he was a young talent. He traveled to the capital and he had the good fortune of being appointed as the teacher to children of very wealthy families in the capital. Now, like the 2, examples that we've just heard, Mr. Shen also deceived those families. How did he deceive those families? Well, he actually wrote the papers for his students. So, basically did their homework for them. He would bribe, in interviews with the families, he would bribe relatives of those families, the servants of those families. There were bribes all around so that they would put in a good word for him and ensure that he would get the job and be appointed. He was supposed to be a teacher, but Mr. Shen actually spent all of his time gambling with his students. So this gambling activities, it wasn't just for fun, but he was making money out of this activity, and it just doesn't sound very right, does it, at this point? Well, he himself is also trying to pass the civil service examinations. And on his way to sit these examinations, at this particular occasion, he actually stays overnight at a temple. And there he dreams of a spirit who informs him that, here you've enjoyed taking a very high salary, teaching salary, and you've misled and deceived all of these students and their families. You've literally not done your duty as a teacher. And as a result of these misdeeds, your lifespan has been so much depleted that your life is about to come to an end. Now, how could you even think about, attempting these civil service examinations and aspiring to the wealth and honor, to become a government official? So right there and then, that spirit actually orders for Mr. Shen to suffer 40 lashes of the whip on his back. And he literally wakes up in pain. Shortly thereafter, he's diagnosed with a deep-seated ulcer on his back, causes him, terrible pain. And it gets so painful that he cries out and, confesses to his misdeeds. So he's, all along, he's very clear about what he's been doing. Other people who haven't found out, well, they hear about it, and as a result, it's sort of recorded as part of his story. And he's so painful that he ends up confessing, and he passes away shortly after. Now, if you think about it, Mr. Shen, he was so highly talented. He had a really bright future ahead of him. He was a young talent, and he could have spent all of his energies and his abilities to tailor the learning for each of his students. Every student will have different gifts, different interests, aptitudes. They need to know different things at different stages of their learning. It depends on their age. So as a teacher in those days, teaching the children of a large family, there'd be in the one classroom, there'd be children of different ages. And, that education for each and every one of them had to be tailored to their individual needs, to be fair to them. But Mr. Shin didn't do any of that. Instead, he spent his time, telling lies, giving bribes, etc., and gambling. And sort of think, what a waste of an opportunity. He could have helped so many young lives. But instead of helping, it was harming and literally destroying those lives. So there were so many things that he should have done that he didn't. And as a result, there were consequences that he suffered. I'm going to share the PowerPoint again. And there's an interesting text. There we go. So the three accounts that I've just sort of related come from this particular volume in the Collectania. Just to make this larger so it's clearer. Now, there's a particular text that comes from the early 3rd century before the Common Era. That's over 2,000 years ago. But what's interesting about it, it's called the Annals of Lu Buwei. But actually, Lu Buwei didn't write this compendium. It's almost like a comprehensive encyclopedia on sort of all things that a person needed to know to govern a universal empire. It's an empire that would be governed, was envisaged as being governed by, principles that would be considered to be just and right by everyone. And what's interesting about this collection, this corpus of knowledge, is that it sort of took into account all of the philosophical trends and thoughts of its time. Sometimes it would combine different ideas that hadn't previously been associated. Sometimes it would adapt the themes. It would refute or reject positions that didn't accord with its basic vision, essentially. So it's a fairly voluminous work. It's about 120,000 Chinese characters in total. And the annals in the title basically refer to sort of the records. And it is, in effect, a comprehensive encyclopedia. But in this particular book, we find that it sets out what makes a competent teacher and an incompetent teacher. And I think that's really interesting questions, and it points it to the broad implications for both scenarios. So just first, it starts with those who are incompetent when it comes to teaching. And here it sort of identifies 3 characteristics you would like. And you might see that in maybe different teachers you've come across, but at the very least, it sort of puts us on alert, especially if we're ever in a role where we have to instruct someone else. Maybe it's not in a formal teaching context. Maybe it could be mentoring or any form of instruction, essentially. So it states that those people whose wishes and moods lack balance, whose preferences frequently change, who lack a constant heart or focus, and who become joyful or angry without reason. So someone who doesn't quite have a stable temperament wouldn't be really a good teacher. It's fairly obvious. Second characteristic. Again, these characteristics don't have to, all be in the one person at the one time. So, person whose discourse and talk changes each day in order to excuse their own conduct. People who, having flaws within, are unwilling to criticize themselves. So they lack self-awareness. They can't seem to practice what they preach, what they ask of their students. They can't really do themselves. And those who, having been unorthodox and excessive, insist on the rightness of what they do and cannot be reproved or swayed. And they're fairly stubborn as well in their own views. So that would also not make for a very good teacher. Then there are those who, upon perceiving a person's power and influence or their wealth and advantage, they don't care about the person's talent or their conduct, but they immediately seek to teach that person, to try to curry favour, flatter them, as if they feared they were not as equal. So this is a person who sets out not to really teach to benefit anyone else, but more for their own self-interest, to shore up their own position in society or in an organisation. And that would also not make for a good teacher. What happens when, under the influence of such a teacher? Well, if a student has put in the hard yards, they can distinguish themselves from the rest of their class. They've attained, broad knowledge. They've been diligent in their studies. Well, as they approach the end of their studies, they're about to graduate, the incompetent teacher will try to repress and repudiate them, keep them at a distance, treat them with jealousy and disgust. So can you imagine there's a antagonism there between teacher and student? The teacher is supposed to be benefiting the student, educating them. They're meant to be on the same side here, but it's very clear that there seems to be an antagonistic relationship. Now, this drives the student away, naturally. They'll want to leave, even while they're still completing their studies. And it's something, if they're caused to break off their studies, well, it'll affect the rest of their life. It's on their record, on their CV, whatever. But why does this happen? It happens because teacher and student are of different minds. And it's an essential aspect of people that they cannot feel close to what they resent. They cannot praise those they dislike. And this brings about the ruin of scholarly endeavour, so learning, scholarship, and the renunciation of the arts, of the Dao. And that's really the bigger picture. Not only does the teacher and student relationship fall apart, the student is turned off from learning anymore, or serious risk of doing so, and therefore, suffer the detriment for the rest of their career. But for anyone else, they would not feel interested in learning if they see that sort of an example. It's a very negative, it's a big negative for the rest of the community. They would look down on both teacher and student. And ultimately, the scholarship, the arts of the Tao, the real scholarship, the scholarship where, our moral characters are galvanized and really cultivated and developed to, realize our innate greatness. And that is what suffers at the end of the day. People are turned off from learning it in the very first place because of such negative role models. So what should be happening? Well, a good teacher is different. A good teacher regards their students as just like himself. So they're really able to put themselves in the position of their students as they teach them. And that's really the spirit, really grasping the true nature of what instruction should be like. What the teacher tries to teach to others, or they would have been able to practice in themselves. So they know what it's like. And when this happens, when the right things happen, both teacher and students are really one and the same. It's like they share the same body. They're on the same side, in the same boat. And it's natural to love and identify with those who are the same as oneself, very similar, to praise those who are the same as oneself, who share the same views. Help those who are the same as oneself. And when this happens, this idea of scholarly endeavor, this learning, research, the arts of the Dao, the subject, or the key subject of that learning is, flourishes, prospers as a result. So everyone benefits in that equation. The teacher benefits because they're able to teach the students benefit because they're able to learn, and everyone is interested in learning because it is really through this learning, especially the traditional education that really works on a person's moral character, that everybody wins. The whole community benefits from having good, decent, honest, principled people within the community. They don't all have to be teachers in every trade or profession. So you can see that that's sort of complete contrast to the passages above, where it's quite a toxic relationship. Okay. Now, in the time that I have left, I'm going to quickly cover the other part of today's passage, to slander fellow students. So fellow students are classmates, people that, if you think about it, we've spent a fair amount of time together with them. Even if you just take the years of our primary education, secondary school, for an example, the hours that we're in school every day. We go to school most days of the week, and we have to go to school for years. So it is through this affinity that we have when we're learning with our classmates, our fellow students, that sort of makes them almost, you could say, our friend, but more than that, they're like our siblings in this particular field of knowledge or expertise. So there are siblings in the same way that we might think of our teachers as our parents, as father of learning of a particular field of scholarship. And so we have these special relationships with our classmates, and the Exalted Treatise alerts us to the fact that we should not slander our fellow students. We should not speak ill of our classmates, nor publicly expose their faults, their shortcomings, and the misconduct. And that's sort of part and parcel of the moral obligations that classmates have to one another. Now, clearly when you're with someone for an extended period of time, studying closely together, you become aware of each other's strengths and faults. And it's quite easy to publicize, criticize, talk about someone's faults. So as a result, we have this reminder in the Exalted Treatise not to slander our classmates. Now, what we should be doing according to the collected commentary on the Exalted Treatise, is to try to learn from those strengths, the strengths of the people around us, especially our classmates, because we have to spend so much time with them, not to dwell on their faults, because at the end of the day, clearly no one is perfect. And it reminds us to be humble, respectful to others, and to be accommodating and harmonious in our interpersonal relationships. But if we drill down, in particular with our fellow students, we would do well if we became aware that they intended on some misconduct, and our relationship was such that they trusted us enough, we should try to counsel or advise them against wrongdoing. That's number one. So you have that moral obligation to try to correct their course of action. In times of hardship, challenges, adversity, it's part of the moral responsibility of a classmate to look after, care for each other, help each other out. If we're trusted with private confidential information by our classmate, then we should maintain that confidence and not, disclose those secrets or confidential information. It's important to maintain contact with our classmates and not to bear grudges. That would clearly stand in the way of, keeping in touch. And finally, classmates will graduate and go on to their respective careers. There will be, some will be more wealthy than others. And among classmates, you can think of the sibling analogy. Well, it's also part and parcel of the moral responsibility to our fellow students to, share and help them out according to within our means, and certainly not to speak ill of our classmates. Now, there's just quickly, I'm going to cover two stories. One is from the collected commentaries on the Exalted Treatise, and it comes from the 12th century. It's about a scholar by the name of Guo Zhi and his classmate by the name of Li Mian. Now, Guo Zhi became quite renowned for his poetry as a young scholar, and Li Mian was jealous of his classmate, so much so that he, publicly denounced his classmate, spoke ill of his classmate. What happened was that, both of them were preparing to undertake the examinations, but Li Mian, the one who was jealous of Guo Zhi, he didn't pass. Guo Zhi passed one exam after the other, and it got to the point where Li Mian sort of wanted to give up and go home. When Guo Zhi found out, he, encouraged Li Mian to keep trying. And after some time, Li Mian did end up passing. But we know from the records that Guo Zhi actually rose through the ranks and became a high government official. He rose to the position of minister to the Song dynasty, as Song emperor at that time. Now, it's a very short story, but you can see that being jealous to the extent of slandering fellow classmates has real consequences. We saw that in Li Mian, how he didn't pass the civil service examinations. That was very significant because that was the entry point to a career as a government official, with all the wealth and honor that such a position would afford. But more than that, when you look at how Guo Zhi responded to someone who had basically tarred his reputation, or tried to, he was able to forgive his classmate, and even just as earlier on in the Exalted Treatise, it guides us to treat another person's loss, as our own, and treat their gains as our own. And we see that he cared enough for Li Mian to forgive what Li Mian had said about him, and also encouraged him to keep on trying for the sake of his own future. So I thought that was quite inspirational. There's another story, and this comes from the Collectania in the very first volume. It relates to two classmates. And this time we have the same feelings of jealousy, but it's expressed in a different way. So there was Liu and Xu. There were two surnames, two classmates during the late 18th century, different time. And they were preparing for the examinations. They happened to sit the examinations in the same place, in the same center, and the conditions were such that they could review each other's papers before they handed it in. That was allowed. Well, when Liu took a look at Xu's paper, realized that Xu had written a much better paper than he had. He took Xu's paper and sort of tried to lose it. He wandered into a crowd, there were crowds of people, and he sort of threw it on the ground. And he came back and told Xu that the paper was lost and there was really nothing that they could do about it. Now, as you can imagine, Xu was completely distraught. He had tried very hard, and he didn't even know where to start looking for his exam paper that needed to be handed in. So he was in tears, but all of a sudden there was a junior government official came along and took out that Xu's examination paper from his sleeve. In those days, people wore sort of long robes, as you can see in this sort of illustration on the cover of volume 1. And those sleeves would function as pockets, sort of deep pockets. And he sort of took the exam paper from his sleeves, handed it to Xu, and said, I just happened to notice a person throwing this on the ground, and so I picked it up. And so Xu ends up being able to hand in his exam paper. And the bottom line is that Xu passed and Liu didn't. So Liu had intentionally, deliberately tried to destroy Xu's prospects out of jealousy and intentionally lied to his classmate about what he had done. He just said, the paper's lost, and really don't know where to find it. And as a result, Liu not only doesn't pass this time, but he never passes. He tries several times, and for the rest of his life, he doesn't pass the civil service examinations. And effectively, his dreams of becoming a government official really do not come to be realized. So you can see that there are real consequences, misfortunate consequences of slandering, speaking ill of our classmates, but also, acting negatively, trying to destroy someone's career even before it started. So I'm going to end on that note. So we've covered both cheating the uninformed and slandering our fellow classmates. Thank you very much for your kind attention today, and look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you very much indeed.